Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. So welcome, Russ.
Thanks for having me on, Vera.
So before we start talking about your article, which was really great, I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about your story. How did you end up where you are now?
Yeah, so my first real job in life was for CrossFit, the fitness company.
Mm-hmm.
And CrossFit was founded by a guy who described himself as a quote unquote rabid libertarian. Greg
Okay.
Glassman, yeah, who was an absolute genius. He founded CrossFit. I worked there for about 10 years. It grew very rapidly from about 2,000 locations to over 15,000 locations in that time.
You worked there as a trainer?
No. I was in the corporate office.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was this actually gets into how I got into what I'm doing now.
Mm-hmm.
CrossFit, just like Uber and other companies, like the first thing we ran into when we started growing was government and lobbyists.
Mm-hmm.
Our competitors were publishing fake science about us, saying we were dangerous, and then taking that to
Yeah.
regulators to impose occupational licensure laws on CrossFit. So through the sort of ideological indoctrination of being affiliated with CrossFit, which was at the
Mm-hmm.
time very
Yeah.
intertwined with like libertarian and right-wing
Mm-hmm.
thought, also then the practical experience of seeing all these small businesses that we were trying to support and defend being threatened by government regulators, it was really a radicalizing experience for me. So after 10 years of CrossFit, I had enough of CrossFit and working for CrossFit, but I definitely wanted to do something in that space. So a job opened up for me at Stand Together, which is part of
Yeah.
the sort of broader philanthropic network founded by Charles Koch, to sort of continue that similar type of work, like pushing back against cronyist and anti-competitive regulation and defending businesses. So I did that for about 5, almost 6 years. And now I'm working on energy policy exclusively at the Prime Mover Institute. I think what you had me on to discuss is total Boomer Luxury Communism, which is just sort of a catchphrase, so to speak, that I've used to describe the American entitlement state, or what Chris Pope at the Manhattan Institute calls the retirement state.
Yeah.
And really just highlighting how generous it is. So I just want to be very clear at the outset. I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert on these fiscal issues. I'm not an expert on the congressional budget process. I'm just someone who, through the course of all that work I've been talking about before, came across all these really outrageous and shocking stats about the national debt and these senior benefits. And I just wanted to make more people aware of it, because right now almost no one even knows that this is happening.
So the piece is called What is Total Boomer Luxury Communism? It was published on the 10th of December in the American Mind. I really recommend that everyone reads it. It has a really cool chart, actually, by Chris Pope at the Manhattan Institute that actually shows the direct tax and entitlement stage by age. So who gets what, who shoulders what. So it's interesting because this is actually something that, as you know, I've been really kind of harping on this idea that actually we have a system that is profoundly unfair, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And in the course of the last few months, I have seen you here and there tweeting about this. And I was thinking, this is awesome. This is awesome. And then you wrote this article. What is the process that led you to not just kind of noticing these things, but also kind of having this aha moment, which is wait a minute, the entitlement system that we have, and we'll talk about how it's not an entitlement actually, but that this is mostly talking about Social Security and Medicare, healthcare spending, and spending on retirement, is this thing that you call the total Boomer luxury system.
It's hard to pinpoint exactly where. I mean, if you wanted to start the story, like for a book, you'd start probably with a dinner I had with a guy named Avery James, who I cite in the piece. And he used to work at the Manhattan Institute And now I think he works at Echelon doing polling. And, he was just explaining to me how Social Security was ripping off younger people. And this was maybe 3 years ago. And he was the first person that put the issue on my radar and also connected me to Chris Pope's work at the Manhattan Institute. From then, after that, I sort of started looking into this issue more. I found Romina Baccia at the Cato Institute. I'd known Kurt Couchman at Americans for Prosperity for a long time, but I'd never really delved into his work. So I started looking into that more. Andrew Biggs at the American Enterprise
Mhm.
Institute as well, and many others, but in that general universe of people. And, I just started just basically being able to wrap my head around this because the scale of numbers we're talking about here is just absolutely massive. It's hard to even think about, right? I mean, it's like 1.1 trillion a year for Medicare, 1.5 or 1.6 trillion a year for Social Security. And yeah.
And Medicare is going to be exploding
Yes.
even more. And if the people who want to keep the extended Obamacare tax credit to maintain them and to make them permanent succeed, healthcare spending in general is going to be enormous. But Medicare, the part for
Yeah.
seniors is really dwarfing everything else pretty much
That's
in the
absolutely
future.
true. Yeah. So when you look at projections of where the increase in the federal debt is going to come from over the next 30 years, it's entirely Social Security and Medicare. Between those two programs, it's mostly Medicare. Social Security is significant. Sometimes people downplay it. From what I remember, it's about a 22 trillion shortfall. But when you look at Medicare, that's really where most of it is. And the pace of growth of Medicare spending is unbelievable, right? I just saw a projection that it's projected to increase from about 2024 to 2033 by a third.
Yeah.
Less than a decade, increase a third. That's crazy. Another interesting thing about this is the federal government spent very little money at all on healthcare, like up until the 1960s. This is not like something that's always been the case.
Oh, and by the way, we're
Yeah.
not spending money on healthcare.
Right.
We're spending money. We're actually not spending money on health outcome. We're spending money on an insurance system,
Yeah.
private or public. I mean, like, that's the thing. It's like we're not even buying health outcome,
Yeah.
right?
And you
It's
can you can see that in the data, right? And then sometimes people will say things like, "Well, it's because the system's messed up and the incentives are wrong." I'm actually even skeptical of that, right? Like I think even if we shifted more money into like preventive care or something like that, like having doctors tell people to eat better or exercise, I don't think that would work either. Like from the data I've seen there, it's a fiscal problem. It's not a
as
healthcare problem.
and it has tons
Yeah,
of incentive problems, right? When you see that, I think it's less than 10% of healthcare spending is actually paid out of pocket.
right.
And most of it is done either through insurance and then the government. I mean, like, for all the reputation of the American system, where French people always say, for instance, you guys don't pay for healthcare, like,
Yeah,
which is kind of like it's as if, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, a majority, I don't know if it's a majority or close to a majority of health spending is actually done by the government, right?
yeah. Off the top of my head, it's about 50-50.
But it's like probably 10% or 11% of total spending is actually done by actual people. And so
Right.
when effectively, let's say you have 90% of healthcare spending that is paid for by not the people who are demanding the healthcare, you right there you have a big problem.
Yeah,
Just right
totally.
there
And
alone.
this is like the more I learn about Medicare for that reason, the more I start to embrace more radical solutions to
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
like what Michael Cannon at Cato has talked
yeah.
about, for example. Because I just think tweaking around the edges when you have all these principal agent problems, all these middlemen, everyone's getting rich off of it, it just seems doomed to fail. I also think we need to reconceptualize how we think about this problem, which is like oftentimes the Social Security problem or the Medicare problem is framed as an insolvency question, right? These trust funds, both Medicare and Social
Mhm.
Security, are projected to be depleted by around 2033. So, how do we close that gap? I don't think that's the right way to think about it. That is a problem. But what I'm trying to highlight in my piece is there's also a question of purpose. What do these programs exist to do, and what should they exist to do? And I don't think senior benefits should exist or be exploited to help insurance companies and certainly not retired millionaires to the degree that they
Yeah.
are. There's a legitimate purpose here, which is keeping people out of poverty, especially seniors, and out
Mhm.
of distress. I support that, but we could save trillions on these programs, over years by tightening them up and still keep every single senior out of poverty. But I wanted to fully answer your question because you sort of asked how
Yeah.
I got to total boomer luxury communism. And so I started with these, just reading these reports, these wonderful white papers by the experts I mentioned. But I realized that it connected to something that I was noticing was happening in the political discourse, especially with young people on both the right and the left. You've got the rise of figures like Mamdani. You've got the rise of like the national conservatives and the new right. And one way to think about this is that it's not about any concrete policy disagreement. It's about generational turnover. People are dissatisfied with what the establishment Democratic Party and the establishment Republican Party have delivered for them. They are dissatisfied as they are, maybe they're 30, maybe they're 25, maybe they're 40, but they're starting to move up in the world and look at the institutions that they're inheriting from older generations, and they're unhappy, right? They're really unhappy, and they're turning to all sorts of bad ideas. Now, the question is, how do you respond to people like that? One way you can respond to them, which is a legitimate way, is like what people like Michael Strain and Scott Winship at the American Enterprise Institute do, which is sort of correct some of their misconceptions, right? Saying, hey, actually, median income has increased a lot, for example. And that's true. I don't mean to demean that. But I think another way you can respond to this unease amongst young people, and I think another way we should be doing more of, is agreeing with them to a degree about, yes, like the game is rigged against you. Yes, this system is unjust. Yes, some pretty radical changes are necessary. And yes, the seniors, the boomers who you're already mad about, they really have rigged the game against you, and they absolutely are benefiting from it. And it is unfair and it should change. And the sooner it changes, the better.
One of the things that we should explain actually, why is it boomer luxury? Like, can
Yes.
you tell us where the boomer luxury part comes from?
So on the boomer part, when you look at the distribution of government taxes versus government benefits across age ranges, what you'll notice is the younger people are paying almost all of the taxes, and the older people are getting almost all of the benefits. And I got into an argument with this guy named Swan Marcus over this recently, and he was saying, well, there are programs like, the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit or SNAP that younger people use. That's true. But look at Chris Pope's data, because those programs are drops in the bucket
Mhm.
compared to Social Security and Medicare. And while it's true that Medicaid is available for younger people, also a lot of its spending is going to older people. The boomer part of it is just recognizing that our government, especially at the federal level, but also increasingly at the local and state level, is tilted towards benefiting baby boomers at the expense of younger generations. So the luxury part, and I want to be clear on this because some people have misunderstood my point. I'm not saying that every baby boomer is rich, and I'm not saying that every baby boomer is getting $60,000 a year in Social Security. Obviously not. That's a minority. But they are the wealthiest cohort, and you got into this in your piece that recently came out. On average, their median net worth is much higher than any other generation, and at the same time, programs like Social Security increase with lifetime earnings. That, to me, that's one of the craziest parts, that we give the most money to people who need it the least.
The way I've always talked about it is the fact that seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile. Basically, they are the most well off in our society. Part of this makes sense, right? We have had capital markets that have delivered just
Yes.
wonders for those willing to invest and put their money aside, save. And of course, housing is contributed a lot to this. Government intervention is actually probably has increased the value of housing, hence increased the wealth of those who have homes. But considering this is true, it makes absolutely no sense to have an entitlement system or a system, Social Security and Medicare, that literally redistributes all these taxes
Yeah.
from those who are overrepresented at the lower income level towards them. That's the part that doesn't make sense. And because
Yeah.
if you see the Pope chart and you say this is now the scale is actually quite impressive, but if you had a thing where the relatively young were distributed to the relatively old and it's 1935, and then basically for most people retiring or not able to work anymore, it meant poverty, then
Yeah.
that makes sense. A system that redistributes from the young to the old when being old means you're going to be destitute, I'm fine with that.
Yes, me
Uh,
too.
but that's not the system we're in right now. And that's the part that is just the most shocking. And then there's the other part that I had never actually quite thought about it this way, but the communism part.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. We have to get people's attention about this. And I also think it's justified. Like, if we were going to say that China's communist and we redistribute 6 times more wealth or more than they do, then what does that make
yeah,
us? And especially like when you look at the total figures here, I mean, it's not small amounts of money. You can have a household earning nearly $120,000 a year just from Social Security.
yeah,
Now you add, Medicare on top of that. They're getting special property tax breaks. There's all sorts of special programs, Medicaid perhaps. I mean, the other funny thing is the way seniors in general think about their wealth and the way they respond to this, but also the way they've been trained to think about it, is they don't look at home equity as part of their wealth.
yeah,
Right?
exactly.
They don't include that, right? So when you look at Medicaid, when they do means testing for long-term care, and Michael Cannon and at Cato and others have been talking about this, but when you look at Medicaid long-term care and they means test to see whether you qualify, you could have a home worth up to nearly $1.1 million. And that doesn't count. That's waived as part of your assets.
Yeah.
So, in other words, this is a lot of the game has been rigged, not just to inflate the wealth of older people, but specifically to keep them in their homes and to keep them from selling their homes. So it also connects to the housing crisis question that we've all been concerned about, especially when you think about the geographical distribution of housing, because the housing crisis is especially acute in particular high growth metropolitan areas, like, for example, the Washington, D.C. metro area. But you've got, and I mentioned this in my piece, you've got entire neighborhoods that have retired people in them that are they're near the metro center, they're near major employers. They would be perfect places to have a job and raise a family. And yet they're entirely owned by retirees, right? Which,
Mhm.
if you think about that from an economic efficiency point of view, that actually, it doesn't make sense. Like, you would think that older people, they no longer need to pay a premium, first of all, for such large homes, 5 bedrooms or whatever. Their kids, they're empty nesters, their kids have moved
Mhm.
out. Secondly, they no longer need to pay a premium to be a 30 or 45-minute commute away from Washington, D.C. So why are they staying in these homes? That's in some of the most desirable parts of Washington, D.C. Well, a lot of it's because all of these government programs at the property tax level, but also at the federal level.
Yeah. And there's another thing that actually my colleague Jack Salmon, when we were talking about this morning, reminded me of, and I'm looking for the number right now, but it's also the fact that contrary to what people believe, actually Social Security and Medicare, they contribute to the accumulation of debt. Payroll tax has not been able to pay for all of the benefits ever since 2010. It's been in a permanent cash flow deficit, which
Yes.
means it's been tapping on these assets in the trust fund that really actually, in
Yes.
order to redeem the assets, you have to go to Treasury, and
This
Treasury
is
is
one of the
withholding
biggest
money.
misconceptions
Yeah.
about it.
But
Yeah.
so what it means is like basically it is the imbalance that you described is compounded by federal borrowing. So here's
Yes.
a number that Jack gave me, and that's from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finance. Right in 2022, Americans under 45 held essentially no government bonds, while those over 75 held on average 1.2 million in government bonds. So what it means is like younger workers are taxed to fund benefits for wealthy retirees and to pay interest on the debt issues to sustain these benefits.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, it even gets worse than that because, I described 4 steps in my piece, right? That baby boomers are taking from younger people. The first is the most obvious. We are directly taxed now to pay for some of their social security and Medicare, right? I think
Yeah.
most people kind of understand that, although
Yeah.
there is confusion, right? Like some people literally think, oh, I paid into social security and then my money was saved somewhere. And now 30 years later, I'm getting it back. No, that did not happen. It's a pay as you go program. Current beneficiaries, their benefits are paid by current workers through payroll taxes. But that's just step one, right? Then the national debt increases because taxes don't fully cover expenditures. And that increase in the national debt is primarily due to entitlements. And let's think about the second and third order consequences of that, right? Because as the national debt increases, and Jack Salmon, I believe your colleague has written about this, we're already past the point at which the debt to GDP ratio is in a dangerous territory where it's impacting economic growth.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean
Okay,
it's
right.
multiple factor, and
Yeah.
of course it impacts interest rates.
Right. It impacts interest rates. It impacts inflation. It
Mhm.
slows economic growth. And therefore, it's reducing already, and it will continue to, the amount of income that younger generations are going to collect their entire lives. So that effect will stay with them. On top of that, they're going to be taxed more, not just now, but for the rest of their lives
Yeah.
to pay off the interest on that debt.
Yeah, and of course, like one of the points I've made in a recent piece about what happens if Congress decides to do the absolutely stupidest and most irresponsible thing, which is when the trust fund dries up, both of them, and they have to decide what to do because benefits are scheduled to be cut. To not to keep to maintain all of these benefits for everyone and to
Yes.
borrow the entirety of the thing, inflation will likely rise in the way we've seen it in 2021.
Yeah.
And the ones who are going to be affected the least by this are seniors because Social Security benefit and Medicare are indexed to inflation, while a lot of other things aren't. So they'll younger generation, people who are working, people who are investing, people entrepreneurs, they will capital gains are not indexed for inflation. Like they're going to be like feeling the heat of inflation, and those who are going to be feeling the heat of inflation the least are going to be the seniors whose benefits are going to be when you look at the COLA adjustment
Yes.
I think it was in 2022. I can't remember when it was. There was this big jump, right, when everyone was suffering. And I'm not saying that it made up for everything, but it certainly made up. It grew more than wages, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The benefits were adjusted upward more than wages were. It's a system that doesn't make any sense. I think it's a system that may have made sense again basing having benefits based on age may have made sense at a time where actually age was a signal of something, of poverty, of needs, but
Yeah.
it isn't the case anymore. What I've been trying to get people to do is with me, and I just don't find a lot of support for this idea, is to completely move away from any age-based program.
Okay.
So they don't make sense anymore. They're not an indicator of anything. We need to move to a needs-based type of thing. And that means that seniors who are not rich and who have needs and who are poor would still in that system, of course, be covered,
Yeah.
right? And the thing that is also interesting, right? It's like for lower income people and healthcare, we have Medicaid. So if anything, Medicare admits in its face that it's actually not a benefit that is for poor people.
I think we can be a little sympathetic to young people who look at this kind of stuff or they see how older people are living and they ask, like, why isn't that available to us? I mean, think about the most
Yeah, yeah.
persistent demand from the left over the past 20 years, Medicare for all. All that literally is saying is the stuff you're giving seniors, we would like as well. Now, I think Medicare for all is a horrible idea. On the other hand, I can't justify on a philosophical basis, to your point, why should we give it to the wealthiest generation, but not the
Yeah.
less wealthy generations? That doesn't make any sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But the thing is, like,
Perfect.
the Democrats are not doing it because they actually think that there is intergenerational unfairness. They are doing it because they think the government should be in charge of absolutely everything. When
Yeah.
what you and I are saying is that we have a system that is profoundly unfair. And the
Yes.
way to actually make it less unfair and less distortive, but really actually less unfair right now is what really preoccupies me, is to just really reduce the benefits for those who just don't need it.
Yes.
And of course, the easiest way to do this is for Social Security. Medicare is a harder problem, but again, I think it should motivate all of us to really tackle Medicare first, because it is the by far the biggest driver of our future debt,
Yeah.
without challenge. And it is healthcare for not the poor people. So,
Definition. Yeah.
so
Yes.
it should be an imperative. I'm so glad you're writing this. By the way, I was interested about the title, Total Boomer Luxury Communism, because
Yes.
the only clever thing I've ever came up with was during the Occupy Wall Street movement, uh, after the Great Recession, was they were occupying Wall Street and saying this is where all the unfairness was. And I was like, no, 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 no. We should, if you want unfairness, occupy AARP, because that's where
Yes.
that's where the unfairness is. But I like your phrase, which you've coined here. So what kind of reception have you received?
It's been fascinating. So I don't have any official statistics on this, but based upon my personal experience, especially on social media, but also talking to people, the way people react has almost nothing to do with their political ideology.
Mhm.
I've gotten some of the most strenuous and venomous pushback that I've gotten has come from self-described conservatives and libertarians. They think they have a
Libertarians?
yes,
Libertarians?
including libertarians, because they think they have a property right to Social Security. They think that they paid taxes to Social Security and therefore they're
Libertarians are for government benefits?
yes, it doesn't make any sense. But here's where it gets even funnier. They call me a Marxist.
Interesting.
I'm most commonly called a Marxist or a communist because I'm saying that younger generations are oppressed and that they accuse me of wanting to confiscate the wealth of older
Mhm.
generations. I don't want to confiscate anything. I just want less of
Government
younger generations.
benefits are not wealth.
Yes.
Government benefits are not is not wealth.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really interesting because, you go back to the New Deal. There, to your earlier point, there are some aspects of the New Deal that we can look at and understand as justifiable, right? Like keeping, especially during a recession, especially given the economics of the 1930s, starting a new government program to keep seniors out of poverty is justifiable. However, FDR was also clever. And at the same time, and you can read his direct quotes on this, he understood that connecting contributions to benefits and making sure it was a universal program would make people feel like they were entitled and that they had a property right
Mhm.
to those benefits. And if you go back even further, I forget the name of the author, but like in the 1910s era progressives, when they were like coming up with this idea of Social Security in America, they understood that Americans were particularly individualistic. They saw it as shameful to depend upon others. So they understood that if they wanted to bring European progressive ideas into America, they had to sort of camouflage it as this individualistic thing.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, that's what's happening with Social Security. I also, and I know it's a Republican idea, but I'm seeing some of this with Medicare Advantage too, frankly, because I'll point out that Medicare Advantage is paying for golf and paying for tennis lessons and horseback riding lessons. And some of the Medicare Advantage programs are doing that. And people tell me, oh, that's a private plan. Well, it's privately administered. It's not privately funded. It's funded by the US
Yeah,
taxpayer.
exactly.
Or even when I point about how much people are confused, they think they're just getting back in Social Security and Medicare what they paid in.
Mhm.
They're getting back way more than that. But they are also confused because they have to pay money to access Medicare. In other words, they feel like it's just the insurance and it's what they're owed. So this whole system
Well, they
has been,
actually, it's
yeah,
not in insurance because
been-
insurance usually are voluntary and Medicare isn't. Aren't
right.
you? Don't you have to be on Medicare when you're
Yes, there's some choices about how you,
yeah.
but yes, yeah, it is a universal program. But my point is just that this situation has been obscured from both baby boomers and young people in various ways, right? They aren't even aware that it's happening. They don't perceive it as communism because they think of it as just what they're owed, right? They call it a social contract.
And they think that when they pay the payroll tax, they're effectively paying for their Social Security benefits, which they are not. They're paying for current retirees. And they think that because they've paid their whole life the payroll tax, then it means that they're going to be owed that money. And it is true, it makes them eligible, but it
Yeah.
doesn't actually give them a right. Basically, and you mentioned that in your piece, Congress can change the law at any time.
Yeah, well, that's obscured too, because by the way we talk about this, because these are referred to as mandatory programs, right? There's this
Yeah.
distinction between mandatory government's congressional appropriations or congressional spending and discretionary. Discretionary would include things like defense, that things that are actually appropriated every year. The entitlement programs are called mandatory programs. They're not actually mandatory. Congress could start changing them whenever it wanted to, but they're described that way. And as a consequence of that kind of thinking and the way the policy is set up now, they just go on autopilot every year. So they're not part of the appropriations process. And this is something that Kurt Couchman at Americans for Prosperity has talked about a lot. He's got a book about it called Fiscal Democracy in America. And, what he points out, which this was shocking to me when I first heard it, but Congress only appropriates about 1/4 of federal spending and none of the revenue. So
Yeah.
it's doing like 1/8 of its job, literally. And then when we look at, why our politics are disordered, Congress seems to be occupied more by people who are interested in performance art than actual the correct functioning of government. Also, the accretion of power by the executive branch at the expense of Congress. So much of this just comes back to the fact that Congress is not using its power of the purse, and it's lost that power of the purse because it's allowed these autopilot programs to go from being just like 1/4 of its budget every year to 3/4.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's going to continue, by the
That's
way.
going to continue. And in fact, when you look at CBO numbers, CBO projects that the amount of borrowing to pay for all the benefits, if Congress decides to keep the benefit intact, to keep this crazy system in place, is going to be $124 trillion over 30 years. And
Yeah.
the rest of the budget, so the part that they actually, is going to be in the surplus by $9 trillion. So that's basically literally 100% of the debt comes from these two programs. And I mean, it's just crazy. But I want to talk to you about what kind of reform you'd like to see
Yeah.
going forward to rectify this unfairness.
Yeah. So I mean, quickly, I think there could be a bipartisan agreement on curtailing overpayments in Medicare Advantage, which lead to things like the horseback riding and the golf balls and all that being covered by Medicare. So that's something easy. Something that's going to happen on our current trajectory fairly soon is when the Social Security Trust Fund runs out in 2033. Unless anything happens to the program between now and then, by law, there will have to be pretty sharp benefit cuts
Over,
across,
yeah, over 20%, 20
yeah,
to
over
23%.
20%. But Andrew Biggs at the American Enterprise Institute, I don't know if he's right on the law. If he's wrong on the law, then we should change the law. But what he's said is it's possible to target those cuts to the highest income people and preserve benefits for the lower income groups. I think that makes sense because the
So,
alternative
yeah,
is going to be an increase in the debt, getting funds from the general fund, or an increase in payroll taxes. I think those are both far worse.
well, they're not just far worse, they're actually compounding the unfairness
Yes.
of the system. They're
Right.
compounding in order to preserve the benefits for these guys who are the richest we've had in the history of the US, the
Not just
richest
that,
cohort.
Big says is U.S. seniors have the most disposable income of any seniors on
Yeah,
earth.
yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like it's like the biggest cohort. And basically, if you borrow money, you'll have higher future taxes, you'll have inflation, which will be borne by the current young people. So that's just on that's compounding the problem. And if you raise the payroll tax or if you raise taxes to pay for it, again, it's working younger Americans who are going to be paying for to print. So I am like dead set against any solution to this that is on the tax side. I've just
Yes.
like I think it should all be on the benefit side. I really liked Biggs and Shapiro's
Yes.
paper on
That's
this.
that's what I was referring to.
I think so. My understanding of this paper, and I wrote about this because I actually really like their solution. The solution is to say if this happens, if they go over the top, what they make the claim legally, and I again, like you, I don't know if it's true or not, that the president would have the authority to actually prioritize the spending. The way it goes, there will still be payroll tax. So basically, they're saying
Yes.
the president will have the power to decide how the revenue from the payroll tax is allocated. And what they're saying is like they're saying we should cap benefits to $2,055, I believe, and then that would allow
Yes.
50% of beneficiaries to basically get all of their benefits, and then it's only the next 50% that are seeing their benefit cuts, and their benefits the cut it grows higher, is bigger, larger as their income is
Yeah.
goes up.
Quick
But
point on that. It's
yeah,
even
yeah,
better than that because what Big says is under not only are the bottom 50% protected from any cuts whatsoever, 80% of people will get either no cut or less of a cut than they would under an across the board cut.
yeah, yeah.
So
Okay, yeah,
80% are better
yeah,
off.
yeah.
It's only the 20% that are bearing more of a burden.
So the number that I know is that, and I think it's still, it's like 1 out of 7 beneficiaries of Social Security actually depend 100% on Social Security
Okay.
for its retirement. So it means that when you have 50%, right, of them getting no cuts at all, you get a lot of people who are going to be made whole. But I think that's so this is they're dealing with the kind of the emergency power that the president may have at the time. But
Yeah.
nothing stops Congress for actually reforming this. What
Yeah.
I like about their solution is like while they're like dealing with what could the president do at the time, blah, even ignore this. Why doesn't Congress do this? I'm
Right.
for like radically means testing Social Security. It just, and yes, I
I do
mean,
have some concerns about the practicalities of means testing that I'd like to talk to you about.
well, I mean, if you
Yeah.
if you cut if you cap effectively your means testing,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, but I guess when I think of means testing, I think like you're going to have to demonstrate your current income or your current wealth.
No, but I mean, I
Uh,
think effectively, if you're capping, that's a way.
But
It's
it's
one
based on
way of means
lifetime
testing.
contributions. It's not
Yeah,
based on
yeah,
your current wealth or
yeah,
income.
yeah. No, no,
So,
but so
yeah.
it, but
Yeah.
in a way, I get the difference, but
Yeah.
technically what you're effectively doing is really cutting more the benefits for those who've had
Yeah.
more contribution, probably because they've had more income.
That's
So
true. But a degree of that is already happening, by the way. So sometimes I'll propose something like that, and they'll be like, "You're trying to turn Social Security into welfare." It already is
yes,
welfare, and there already are bends in the formula where it goes from like I forget the exact numbers, but it goes from like you get 90% of your contributions back, and then at a higher income level, it's lower percentage, and then a higher income level, it's even
no,
lower
it's already
percentage. And
means
drops. So it's already a progressive formula. Yeah.
but it's means tested also in the sense that you get your benefits are getting taxed, and there's
Yes.
like and there's I can't remember how it works, but still, I mean, it's a very regressive system because of who pays for what for whom, right?
Yes. Exactly.
So, I mean, so I really like the idea of capping benefits. That I like. I like a lot. I mean, there are just many different ways, like if we moved away from an age-based thing where effectively It just would be a needs type thing. I don't know how that works really in practice, but we cannot continue having this system. And for Medicare, what do you have anything you like?
I've looked at particular changes to that. I've looked at Paragon Institute, for
Hmm.
example. They've got some particular tweaks, but none of it satisfies me because, again, like to me, the issue with Medicare is, and we should do those things. If they save money, we should do those things. But to me, to reiterate what I said earlier, it's not just a math problem. It's not just a
Yeah,
solvency
yeah,
question. It's not just how do we pay for these programs. I don't like Medicare really to a large extent at all, at least not the way it's currently set up. Something Michael Cannon, I referred to him earlier, has proposed is turning it more into like a social security type system where we're just going to pay you a certain amount of money and then you decide how you want to spend that on healthcare,
hmm,
right? You cut some of the middlemen out of it. That makes sense to me. The question I do have though is to what extent any of this is politically doable. I don't know the answer to that, especially on Medicare. There are going to need to be some changes probably that happen when the Part A, the hospital insurance trust fund, runs out in 2033 or whenever it actually does. The other thing is that there is a bit similar to Social Security. There is a bit of a progressive correction in the IRMA calculations. Have you heard of that? So some people have proposed basically making higher income groups pay even higher premiums, or for example, but I think there are just some, maybe we should consider some of those things, but there are also some core structural principal agent and incentive misalignment problems that are happening here that need to be addressed at some point.
yeah. I mean, I this is actually what I really liked about your article and all the tweets I've seen of you from you is precisely that you point out that this is not just a math problem. This is unfair. These are programs that are just profoundly unfair. Were they solvent, they would still be remarkably unfair, and we
Yeah.
should still want to change them.
Yeah.
Um,
And
so
by the way, the fact that like like some people say, well, Social Security doesn't really have a funding problem because it's funded by payroll taxes. I mean, the fact that the taxes that people pay has a name Social Security attached to it means nothing, right?
yeah,
The fact is
yeah,
it's crowding out other forms of taxation or and other forms of revenue. And what I mean by that is we can only raise the federal tax rate to a certain height before it starts having disastrous economic questions. The more payroll taxes take up as that's at the expense of other revenue. Right. So this notion that we can like cleanly distinguish Social Security as a program in its solvency from the rest of the federal budget doesn't make any sense to me.
well, I would rather keep more of my money and invest it,
Yeah.
right? Rather than actually have the government take it, spend it, and then just give the program an IOU for the future, which is what's been happening. So
Right.
past generations have been taxed above and beyond what benefits, what taxes were required to pay benefits for the year when they were taxed. And now the program is just redeeming these bonds, and but the money has been spent. That revenue that was given to Treasury was spent. So it was contributing on top of that to the big government program, to malinvestment, to crowding out, to all sorts of things. It's
Yes.
not as if they were actually placing the money, investing the money, and keeping it to pay for retirement and future generation. And in a sense, guaranteeing that no one would ever have to actually pay higher taxes for this. It's a terrible system. The political side of things, I think, is very important because voters seniors vote. They vote
Yes.
at a higher rate. I don't know if it's been true in the latest election,
I
but
think it has been.
traditionally
Yeah. Yeah.
traditionally it has been true. And so I
Well,
just really
I have some dirty tricks in mind here, which is I think we need to split them as a voting block, right?
yes,
And that's in part why I'm singling out the higher income and higher wealth seniors, because what I'm telling again, look, think about the Andrew Biggs plan. 80% of seniors are better off under his plan than what's going to happen under the if the status quo continues. Essentially, what we're saying is 80% of seniors, we're protecting your interests or keeping Social Security or whatever your benefits are to keep you out of poverty, it's that highest quintile or so that needs to bear some of the burden here, right? So I hope, and perhaps this is naive, but I hope that's a way to sort of weaken the power of the senior lobby.
Yeah, and I also think it is worth trying to split the younger generation from the older generation, because if young generations started voting for people who will promise to them that they will reform these
Yeah.
entitlement reform, instead of having the senior people voting for people who promise that they will not touch, which is what's been happening. And since the senior have been a bigger block, right?
Yes.
Like they've won. But if there was a flip and actually like there was actually a real electoral push from younger generation to say we will elect people who guarantee us that this is not going to be resolved with higher inflation, higher taxes on us because that's
Yeah.
on them, then that may make a difference. So
Yeah.
I think you've done a great job for something that I think is extremely important.
Yeah, so one quick follow-up point on that, because I totally agree with you, but there's an electoral opportunity here that right-wing parties especially need to realize, because if you look at the 2024 election results, and David Shore, who's a Democratic pollster actually, has talked about this. Also, you look at some of the polls now that are coming out of Canada, young people have been moving rightward. But if you look at the polls in the United States since the 2024 election, they've been a little dissatisfied so far with the Republican Party. In other words, they're curious about voting for conservatives, and they might do it once or twice. But if conservative or right leaning parties around the world want to capture this opportunity, they have to put forth a political agenda that advances the material interests of younger generations. And it has to include housing, and it has to include economic growth, and it has to include entitlement reform.
So thanks so much. And I'm so
Thank you.
glad we got to talk about this because it's just very rare to find people who talk about the fairness and or the unfairness issue of our system. So thanks, Russ.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Vera.